Hey everybody, this is Chapter 2 of Philosophical and Political Consequences of the Critique of Political Economy by Jeanne Schuler and Patrick Murray. Chapter 2 is titled Recognizing Capital, Some Barriers to Public Discourse About Capital. The headings are Recognizing Capital, What Makes It Hard, What is Capital, What Makes Capital Hard to Recognize, Recognizing Capital, and the quote, Politics of Identity, end quote. Critique of Fraser on Redistribution and Recognition, on Capital and the Politics of Identity and Recognition, Conceptual and Political Blockages and Openings to Recognizing Capital, Getting Beyond the Conversation Stopper, It's the Economy, Stupid. Appendix, Letter from Patrick Murray to Judith Butler, December 16, 1995. Bibliography. Okay. Oh yeah, I forgot this has fucking endnotes. I was talking to my my history doctoral advisor today, and he said no one reads endnotes, and I'm like, I do. I mean, no one reads footnotes. Who gives a shit? I'm like, come on, they're important, man. They tell you what the hell, they keep you fucking on track. Okay, so let's rock. Recognizing Capital, Some Barriers to Public Discourse About Capital. Through a certain PhD in philosophy who never got a job in the field wrote long ago, unfinished work on the subject over a century ago, the determining social form under which the globe increasingly groans remains poorly understood. We still have a long way to go in recognizing capital. Shit, I fucked that up. Though a certain PhD in philosophy who never got a job in the field wrote a long, unfinished work on the subject over a century ago, the determining social form under which the globe increasingly groans remains poorly understood. We still have a long way to go in recognizing capital. Fucked up the first sentence. We want to examine some of the reasons for that, as well as some of its consequences. Our essay divides into 3 parts. First, we consider what capital is, and why capital is difficult to recognize. Secondly, we examine the consequences of the failure to reconceptualize capital for thinking about the politics of identity. In this part, we will first respond to a recent article by Nancy Fraser titled From Redistribution to Recognition, Dilemmas of Justice in a, quote, post-socialist, end quote, age, and then do some thinking of our own on capital and the politics of identity. Third, we survey some conceptual and political barriers and openings to a better recognition of capital. New section, Recognizing Capital, What Makes It Hard. Heading, What is capital? Capital is a peculiar and stunning social form of wealth and the production of wealth. Capital is inherently dynamic and global. Capital is not use values, not money, not commodities, not means of production, as many common sense or social scientific notions would have it. Capital is not, quote, wealth. That is, it is not merely wealth capable of being employed in the production of new wealth. Rather, capital is a specific social form of wealth, and the production of wealth that is organized around a definite, if bizarre, purpose, namely the endless accumulation of surplus value. Capital involves a class system of expropriation in which wage laborers are free to contract with those who own the wherewithal to produce, the capitalists. Since workers are legally free and, quote, free of alternative means of support. What capitalists expropriate from wage laborers is not surplus, quote, wealth, but surplus value. That is, wealth in a determinate social form, in the value form. Value is the basis for the equivalencies asserted when commodities are exchanged. Value is the residue of the blind, coercive, abstract, and impersonal social form of labor under capitalism. Value itself cannot appear. What would, quote, congealed socially necessary abstract labor, unquote, look like? Value can appear only as something other than value self, namely money. Money is not a mere, quote, technical support to the production of, quote, wealth. No, capital necessarily expresses itself and takes its own measure in money. To identify capital with commodities or with money is wrongly to reduce an internally more complex value form, capital, to value forms proper to simple commodity circulation. But to identify capital simply with means and materials of production is utterly to fail to recognize capital for what it is, not a thing and not a historical constant, but an uncanny and astoundingly powerful, a social form of wealth, turned into a, quote, automatic subject and, quote, lording it over the globe. As Marx put it, quote, capital, as self-valorizing value, does not just comprise class relations, a definite social character that depends on the existence of labor as wage labor. It is a movement, a circulatory process, through different stages, which itself in turn includes three different forms of the, quote, circulatory process. Hence, it can only be grasped as a movement and not as a static thing. End quote, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 2. The circulation of capital involves not simply a flow of materials, but ongoing metamorphoses, an endless flow of forms from money capital to productive capital to commodity capital and back to money capital, which explains why capital cannot simply be identified with money, means of production, or commodities. To sum up, capital is not, quote, wealth. Quote, wealth is not inherently dynamic and global. Capital is. Quote, wealth need not be measured in money. Capital must. Quote, wealth is not bound by class antagonism. Capital is. Quote, wealth does not force the generalization of commodity circulation, including the commodification of land and labor power. Capital does. Quote, wealth does not set a determinate collective good. Capital does. Endless money making. Quote, wealth is not bound up with liberalism's formal recognition of the dignity of each bargaining person. Capital is. Quote, wealth lacks any determining social form and is therefore merely an abstraction, nothing actual. Capital is the actuality of coercive rule by abstraction. New heading. What makes capital hard to recognize? The concept of capital involves great subtlety and complexity, and we just scratched the surface. We need only contrast it with the common ahistorical notion of capital as, quote, wealth producing wealth, end quote. That is, use values of undetermined social form that can be used to produce new use values. In order to identify one high and unavoidable hurdle to recognizing capital, thinking about capital is intellectually very demanding. Capital is a particular social form, and not only is it difficult to attend to forms and formal causality have been whipping boys of modern and postmodern thought. Our intellectual climate is generally hostile to forms, social or otherwise. Modern and postmodern anti-essentialism close off the conceptual space for recognizing capital and tracking its pervasive influence throughout culture and the world. Form speaks to the peculiar necessity exerted by something. What makes something what it is cuts deeper than an interpreting framework, and with more specificity than an amorphous and underlying power. To speak of forms is not to deny that forms can come and go. Neither is it to assert that any one form determines the way events actually occur. But form best describes the insistence at work throughout advanced capitalist society. The insistencies of the value forms, commodity, money, wages, capital, are real enough. Giving up on form makes us less able to get hold of the forces at work in the world. Ironically, just as capitalism's grip intensifies dramatically, the conceptual resources to talk about this penetration are being cast off as out of date. That's not accidental, for, Marx argues, this modern resurgence of anti-Aristotelian thought is itself bound up with capitalism's rise to hegemonic status, But to show that would require another paper. Footnote. Here is a sketch of the argument. In modern philosophy, forms, essences, natures come to be thought of as, quote, fictions, Bacon, because they are believed to be the product solely of the, quote, workman of the understanding, end quote. It's me. Because they are believed to be products solely of, quote, the workmanship of the understanding, end quote, as Locke put it. For it is assumed that this, quote, workmanship is the pure activity of the mind, projecting cognitive, quote, value added, end quote, onto the, quote, materials provided by sensation. The products of this purely subjective, quote, work of the knower, then, are not, quote, real essences, end quote, but, quote, purely subjective, end quote, impositions, fictions made up, not found out. Marx explains how the capitalist mode of production summons this notion of, quote, purely subjective, quote, value added, end quote. In capitalism, products have the peculiarly inscrutable social form of value, which, since it is congealed socially necessary abstract labor, a, quote, ghostly objectivity, end quote, can appear only as something other than itself, namely money. Going into a production process, the needed means and materials have a price. Consequent to the production process, the products are sold, leaving the impression that the difference in the two monetary sums measures the, quote, value added, end quote, by parenthesis pure and parenthesis labor. In this way, everyday forms of life under capitalism lend an air of plausibility to what Marx regards as a couple of bad abstractions, pure thought and pure labor, and thereby some respectability for the modern attack on Aristotelian real essences. Classical and neoclassical economics, much of what goes under the name of socialist or even Marxist economics, fail miserably at conceptualizing capital. They fail to recognize capital as a particular social form of wealth and the production of wealth. Martha Campbell reminds us of the chasm that separates Marx's critique of political economy from classical and neoclassical economics when she writes, quote, there are no counterparts to Marx's concepts in either classical or utility theory, end quote. Martha Campbell. Martha Campbell being part of the International Symposium of Marxian Theory, with some of the, in my opinion, the best minds of talking about Marx's critique of political economy. And that particular quote is from the essay Marx's Concept of Economic Relations and the Method of Capital, the book. In the book, Marx's Method in the book Capital, edited by Fred Mosley, published in 1993. Back to the text. Marx's critique of political economy. Marx was no, quote, economist, end quote, rests on a profoundly different conceptualization of, quote, the economy, end quote, from those commonplace in the dismal science. The difference lies in Marx's insistence that human wealth needs labor and productive interchange with non-human nature, always have a determining social form, and that these social forms matter all the way down. Quote, all production is appropriation of nature on the part of an individual within and through a specific form of society, end quote, writes Marx in the Grundrisse. Capital, the book, well, I don't know. It says it's capital in italics, so I don't know. I'm used, but it doesn't seem like that's what. It seems like he's actually referencing capital, the social form. Capital is such a social form. In short, almost all of modern economic and social science, including socialist and Marxist contributions, conspire to make capital unrecognizable. Footnote: in this connection, see Simon Clark, Marx, Marginalism, and Modern Sociology, which of course is on this channel. This sorry situation is no simple testament to the ill will or blockheadedness of modern economic and social science. We shouldn't jump to the conclusion that Smith, Ricardo, Bumbaverk, whose critique of Marx is on this channel, Jevons, Weber, and Parsons were all on the take, for capital conceals itself. Capitalism writes capitalism's social form, the value form all over itself in invisible ink. Oh, that's good. I'll copy that one down. This takes us into the socio-epistemological dimension of Marx's theory of value as a social form. Unlike Ricardo's naturalistic, or better, a social approach to value, Marx's theory of value just is his theory of the social form of labor and wealth under capitalism. Marx's theory of value just is Marx's theory of the social form of labor and wealth under capitalism. Marx identified the omission of any analysis of the value form, as opposed to the magnitude of value, as a cardinal sin of classical political economy, a judgment that extends to neoclassical economics, whose forerunner, Samuel Bailey, Marx carefully evaluated. What Marx's analysis of the value form revealed, however, is that value, that is, the social form of labor and wealth in capitalism, cannot appear itself, but only as something other, as a thing, as money. Footnote. On this point, see Patrick Murray's The Necessity of Money, How Hegel Helped Marx Surpass Ricardo's Theory of Value, which is a great essay. I read it. It's not on this channel, but it's phenomenal. The oddities of the value form, then, set up a situation more baffling than that presented by a ventriloquist. While the ventriloquist appears not to be speaking, just as the capitalist production process appears not to have a social form, at least what is, quote, thrown by a ventriloquist is recognizable as a voice. But who would identify what is, quote, thrown by value, a bare thing, money, as a social form? This creates the illusion that the capitalist economy is, quote, the economy, end quote, pure and simple. Quote, the economy, end quote, finally, quote, disembedded, end quote, from, quote, non-economic, end quote, encumbrances, and thereby a proper object of study for the science of, quote, economics, end quote. Footnote. For a critique of Karl Polanyi along these lines, see pages 5 to 7 of the general introduction to the book, Reflections on Commercial Life, an anthology of classic texts from Plato to the present, edited by Patrick Murray. I'd really like to read that. But this notion of an actual economic order, free of any determining social form, the idea that there can be an actually existing, quote, economy in general, end quote, is really only, quote, the illusion of the economic, end quote. It is truly the, quote, illusion of the epoch, end quote. Clearly, capitalists and their minions are in no hurry to see capital recognized for what capital is. Given the power the capitalists wield in capitalist societies, this constitutes a pervasive obstruction to our recognizing capital. Thus, the elusiveness of capital results jointly from conceptual complexity, capital's self-concealing character, and political reluctance to bring the subject out of hiding. New section, recognizing capital and the, quote, politics of identity, end quote. What are the consequences of failing to recognize capital for the politics of identity? We will begin with Nancy Fraser's article, and then turn to several observations of our own regarding capital and identity politics. New heading, Critique of Fraser on Redistribution and Recognition. In an article published by the New Left Review in 1995, Nancy Fraser observes, quote, the, quote, struggle for recognition, end quote, is fast becoming the paradigmatic form of political conflict in the late 20th century. Demands for, quote, recognition of difference, end quote, fuel struggles of groups mobilized under the banners of nationality, ethnicity, quote, race, gender, and sexuality, end quote. Footnote. Nancy Fraser's article, From Redistribution to Recognition, Dilemmas of Justice in a, quote, post-socialist, end quote, age. Published in New Left Review, 1st of July, 1995. Reprinted in the book by Nancy Fraser, Justice Interruptus, Critical Reflections on the, quote, post-socialist, end quote, condition. Published in 1997. Fraser worries about ascendant, quote, identity politics, and, quote, being disconnected from a much-needed politics of, quote, redistribution. Quote, my larger aim is to connect two political problematics that are currently dissociated from one another, end quote. Nancy Fraser. We share Fraser's aim of conceptualizing a non-reductive politics of redistribution and recognition, but we question her way of framing the issue. Footnote. A valuable earlier investigation into how the politics of redistribution and recognition match up may be found in Milton Fisk's article, Feminism, Socialism, and Historical Materialism, published in the Praxis Journal. And footnote. We reconceive Fraser's project as a project that investigates the relationship between capital rather than redistribution, and the politics of recognition. That leads naturally to the question, what is Fraser's concept of capital? Answering that question leads us to make three judgments. A. Fraser's notion of, quote, redistribution belongs to a, quote, left Ricardian approach to capital rather than a Marxian approach to capital. B. Fraser's view of capital and the politics of recognition is too, quote, demarcationist, end quote, too external, even though Fraser's purpose is to join the forces fighting for recognition and for redistribution, and even though Fraser repeatedly insists on how the two are, quote, intertwined, end quote, the framework of Fraser's analysis remains dualistic. And C. The shortcomings of a conception of capital which neglects the basic question of the social form of wealth and wealth-producing activities explain why she's stuck with an external relation between redistribution and recognition. Fraser's demarcationist account keeps from the view of many powerful conceptual connections between capital and identity. Capital's power, the causality of capitalist social forms, is altogether left out of the, quote, left Ricardian, end quote, picture of inequitably divided, quote, wealth. Unlike capital, quote, wealth is a dull concept, it won't do much work. A. Fraser associates, quote, redistribution with redressing, quote, material inequality, and with a socialist imaginary centered on terms such as, quote, interest, quote, exploitation, and, quote, redistribution. But this, quote, imaginary, end quote, may be termed as a, quote, left Ricardian, end quote, imaginary. For this, quote, imaginary identifies capital with the systematic expropriation by capitalists of surplus wealth created by wage laborers. Like Ricardian thought in general, what this leftist version neglects to theorize are questions such as, what is the social form of this inequitably divided wealth, and what is the specific social form of the labor that produces it? But not theorizing these and related questions, Fraser slips into the, quote, illusion of the economic, end quote. That is, that wealth and the creation of wealth can exist without determining social forms. That wealth and creation of wealth can exist without determining social forms, and by the same token she forecloses any investigation of the powers of capitalist social forms. Here is the heart of our counterproposal. We suggest reframing the project of reconceptualizing, quote, redistribution and, quote, recognition, and building it out from the Marxian theory of capital in place of the left Ricardian horizon of redistributing, quote, wealth. B. Despite our efforts to the contrary, Fraser's conceptualization of capital and recognition is demarcationist. That is, it conceives of the two as independent spheres. Fraser emphasizes that the distinction between redistribution and recognition is an analytical one, and Fraser repeatedly notes the interconnectedness of the two. It's the inner INNER, connectedness, that slips through these terms of engagement. When, Fraser writes, quote, in the real world, of course, culture and political economy are always imbricated with one another, and virtually every struggle against injustice, when properly understood, implies demands for both redistribution and recognition, end quote. Fraser. We need to inquire further exactly how are, quote, culture and, quote, economy being conceptualized. The term, quote, imbricated, end quote, refers to an overlapping, as with tiles and shingles, but tiles and shingles can stand alone. Quote, culture and, quote, economy cannot. Fraser's concepts suggest a multi-layered interaction of independently constituted, freestanding spheres. That's the flypaper, quote, illusion of the economic, end quote, again. No actual economic order can be adequately conceptualized in abstraction from cultural factors, notably from ways of recognition. In particular, the form of abstract recognition involved in wage labor, like wage labor itself, belongs to what makes capital capital. It's not a cultural accompaniment. So, despite the talk of a, quote, constitutive, irreducible political economic dimension, end quote, to culture, this picture remains demarcationist. Moreover, the text confirms this. Quote, thus, far from occupying two airtight separate spheres, economic injustice and cultural injustice are usually imbricated so as to reinforce one another dialectically. Cultural norms that are unfairly biased against some are institutionalized in the state and the economy. Meanwhile, economic disadvantage impedes equal participation in the making of culture, in public spheres and in everyday life. The result is often a vicious circle of cultural and economic subordination, end quote. Fraser is surely right. The, quote, sexual, racial, religious, and other biases get institutionalized in the state and the economy, end quote. This institutionalization of prejudice remains a fundamentally external relationship. Footnote. An excellent recent study of just that sort of institutionalization of racism leading to a vicious circle is Melvin L. Oliver and Thomas M. Shapiro's book, Black Wealth, White Wealth, A New Perspective on Racial Inequality, published in 1995. Let me go back. Let me reread that sentence I just read. And footnote. Fraser is surely right that, quote, sexual, racial, religious, and other biases get institutionalized in the state and the economy, end quote. But this institutionalization of prejudice remains a fundamentally external relationship. Fraser writes, quote, gender, for example, has political economic dimensions. Gender is a basic structuring principle of the political economy. On the one hand, gender structures the fundamental division between paid, quote, productive labor and unpaid, quote, reproductive and domestic labor, assigning women primary responsibility. On the other hand, gender also structures the division within paid labor between higher paid, male-dominated manufacturing and professional occupations and lower paid, female-dominated, quote, pink-collar and domestic service occupations, end quote. But what counts as, quote, a basic structuring principle of the political economy, end quote? While affirming that male supremacy is institutionalized in the, quote, really existing, end quote, capitalist economies, we contend that it is not a, quote, basic structuring principle, end quote, of capitalism that domestic work be done by women, neither is it a principle of capitalism that the paid labor force be structured to advantage men at the expense of women. We distinguish between what are truly structural principles of a capitalist economy, what is essential to capitalism, and what are not. The distinction between paid, quote, productive, end quote, labor and unpaid domestic labor is essential since wage laborers must be free persons, not capitalistically produced commodities, reared in a domestic sphere, at least formally independent of capital. But the further specification that domestic labor be unequally divided, with women shouldering the greater portion of it, while deeply entrenched, is not an essential feature of capitalism. Why should the distinction between what is essential to capitalism and what is not matter? Isn't a squabble over words or worse special pleading for a Marxist hobby horse? Making the distinction is important because the conditions for reproducing the structural principles essential to a capitalist economy differ from the conditions for reentrenching patriarchy, or racism, or homophobia. Footnote. In a plenary talk she gave at the, quote, Rethinking Marxism conference held at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst in November of 1996, Judith Butler argued that Fraser wrongly classifies homophobia as a struggle for recognition. Butler argued that homophobia is, in Fraser's terminology, quote, bivalent, end quote, like racism and patriarchy, because capitalism institutionalizes homophobia to maintain the private, quote, domestic sphere, end quote, where the working class must be constantly reproduced. This makes a good point against Fraser, but it is not clear that homophobia is a necessary principle of a capitalist economy any more than is racism or patriarchy. On the contrary, the abstractness and impersonality of capitalist social forms work, not without contradictions, against such prejudices. And footnote. Do we have any good reason to believe that it would spell the end of capitalism if domestic labor were equally shared out between men and women, or if women were not super exploited and marginalized? Institutionalized discrimination against targeted groups in the economy and politics is painfully real, but such discrimination does not belong to the conceptualization of what a capitalist economy is. I'm going to repeat that. Institutionalized discrimination against targeted groups in the economy and politics is painfully real, but such discrimination does not belong to the conceptualization of what a capitalist economy is. What needs distinguishing is the difference between how a particular economic order essentially functions. Let me repeat that. I fucked that up. Sorry. What needs distinguishing is the difference between how a particular economic order essentially affects recognition, and recognitions being affected by how a particular economic order happens to behave in a specific space and time. What needs distinguishing is the difference between how a particular economic order essentially affects recognition, and recognitions being affected by how a particular economic order happens to behave in a specific time and place. What indications there are suggest that Fraser has the second thought in mind, not the first. One second. Relatedly, the way Fraser uses the term, quote, dialectical, suggests Fraser understands it to mean a back and forth interplay between two entities, each capable of standing alone. What might be better be termed, quote, synergy, not the exposition of the actual inseparability of two putatively independent entities, which we take to be the proper use of the term, quote, dialectical. In this connection, we note that Fraser identifies Hegel as the paradigmatic philosopher of recognition and the intellectual ancestor of two prominent philosophers of recognition, Charles Taylor and Axel Honneth. By contrast, we would argue that Hegel, like Marx, is better thought of as conceptualizing the inextricability of modes of recognition from definite economic orders. Fraser worries that the pursuit of political and economic equality requires putting one's group identity, quote, out of business, end quote. This dilemma appears to be based on a non sequitur. Redress of political and economic injustices does not require identity groups to disclaim their distinctiveness. This dilemma appears to be based on a non sequitur. Redress of political and economic injustices does not require identity groups to disclaim their distinctiveness. I have to look up what non sequitur means, a conclusion or statement that does not logically follow from the previous argument or statement. Here Fraser seems to slip back into the position Bruno Bauer took on the Jewish question. To become true Prussian citizens, the Jews would have to give up their Jewishness and Christians would have to quit being Christians. To this, Marx countered, nothing of the sort is required. On the contrary, modern liberalism explicitly protects religious and other freedoms of association. Capitalism has other ways of dissolving group identities, for example, gradually eroding thicker understandings of particularity with the watery goodwill of consumer society. Maintaining a strong identity requires too much deliberate effort, once basic civil rights or economic security seem possible. C. Fraser's demarcationist conceptualization of recognition and economy as tightly overlapping one another stems from the fundamental shortcoming of the, quote, redistributionist or, quote, left-Ricardian imaginary, namely, it's fair to ask, what exactly is it that is being inequitably distributed? What exactly is it that is being inequitably distributed? To answer, quote, wealth is to ignore the insistent follow-up question. Wealth determined by what social form? Wealth determined by what social form? To know what wealth is, requires identifying wealth's determinate social form. For determinate forms of recognition belong to, rather than accompany, no matter how closely any given form of wealth and wealth creation, and these forms matter. New section, on capital and the politics of identity and recognition. If we replace a, quote, left-Ricardian concept of capital with a Marxian one, how does that influence our approach to the politics of identity? Why should it matter? One short answer, capital is rich in conceptual determinations, while, quote, wealth is poor. The strategy of demarcation goes hand in hand with a static, flat notion of capital that requires all resistance to capital to come from somewhere outside the, quote, economic realm. Demarcation establishes external oppositions meant to generate limits or brakes on the domination of a runaway, quote, economic and, quote, logic. By contrast, a more dialectical and dynamic notion of capital as the flow of forms, which aren't restricted to the, quote, economic sector, refashions the meaning of resistance. Resistance now begins internal to the value form, prior to distribution, in the tensions between exchange value and use value. The interplay between use value and exchange value occurs in a force field, with resistance occurring internal to the forms. For example, in the friction exerted by non-human nature, space-time desires, needs, or household life to the spiraling requirements of the value form. It is bad capitalist ideology to conceive of nature as infinitely malleable, passively drafted by the roving capitalist imagination to serve capital's purposes. Nor does resistance occur, for the most part, quote, outside the pressure field, for example, in the realms of culture or politics. Footnote. As Marx observed in the Grundrisse, quote, use value in itself does not have the boundlessness of value as such, end quote. End footnote. The genuinely oppositional force of some kinds of identity politics goes through the value forms rather than attempting the increasingly futile task of locating a vantage point from without. How does a more exacting concept of capital shed light on the politics of identity? To this basic question, we offer the following observations. A. Identity involves a reflective stance towards one's identity, no longer tacit and submerged. The politics of recognition makes identity thematic, quote, black is beautiful, quote, sisterhood is powerful, and, quote, gay pride. Their reflection may be provoked in various ways. Capitalism fosters a reflective society like nothing else. Why? For several reasons. To mention two, capitalism has its own table of values, one which inevitably conflicts with customary codes and parochial ways of forming identity. The intrusion of the new table of values compels reflection on the customary ones. Plato's Republic, set in Athens' commercial port, the Piraeus, may be read as taking stock of this sort of upheaval. Secondly, capitalism is expansive. World trade is capitalism's destiny. Such commerce brings people of very different customs, religions, and practices into face-to-face relations with one another. This, too, spurs reflection as trading partners begin to recognize their identities, particular and different from those of others. B. The egalitarianism implicit in the wage labor form, with its built-in respect for the bargaining person, lays a strong foundation for liberal political ideas, including those of equal treatment, tolerance, and human rights generally. Often identity politics functions on this liberal plane, where value forms shape its agenda and give it force. The egalitarianism implicit in money in the wage form is a double-edged sword, however. While it promotes tolerance, it can also be a powerful force for social homogenization. Søren Kierkegaard wrote of traditional cultures being consumed in the, quote, hopeless forest fire of abstraction, whipped up by the spread of markets and modernization. End quote. Kierkegaard. In The Two Ages, published in English in Princeton University Press in 1978. Georg Simmel called money, quote, the frightful leveler, end quote. And in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels wrote of the impact of capitalism on traditional identities. Quote, all that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, end quote. Communist Manifesto. As a human habitat destroyer, capital is a huge force for assimilation, with an irony that much disturbed John Stuart Mill in On Liberty. The commercial forces that open up new horizons of tolerance are also conducive to an ominous conformism. Beware the body statures! Exclamation point. The, quote, leveling power of capital acts both on the plane of generalized commodity circulation, money and commodities, buyers and sellers, and on the level of capital. Footnote, these are nicely sorted out in David Harvey's article, Money, Time, Space in the City, published in The Urban Experience. In commodity circulation, we are identified as freely contracting persons responding to our own needs. The scrawny identity of the individual that matters for simple commodity circulation is pretty much Michael Sandel's, quote, unencumbered self, end quote. Footnote, see Michael Sandel's book, Liberalism and the Limits of Justice. At the capital level, the demands that capital accumulation places on the time and mobility of wage laborers work as powerful forces to destabilize and break up strong identity-forming practices and institutions. As Marx put it in the Grundrisse, quote, if money is not the community, money destroys the community, end quote. D, quote, identity politics, end quote, domestically and internationally can arise as a reaction to the shallow, amnesiac, quote, white bread, end quote, identities ground out by commercial life. What Dorothy Zola, or Zoll, S-O-E-L-L-E, calls a, quote, rebellion against banality, end quote, can spur forms of identity politics varying in their authenticity and artificiality. Footnote, see the article by Dorothy Zoll titled Rebellion Against Banality in the book The Strength of the Weak. Identity politics in some postmodern forms seems to mimic the apparent powers of capital, freely to dissolve and recreate any content. The utopian vision of identity, quote, quick change, end quote, acts where identities are swiftly constructed and deconstructed, resembles a capitalist fantasy more than human liberation. F. Ever clever about making a buck and no stranger to profitably coping with the mess it makes, capital gets involved in the booming, quote, identity industries, end quote, in several ways. Capital instrumentalizes existing identities, or at least popular images of existing identities, to sell products, for example, when a, quote, old world, and, quote, Italian grandma hypes mass-produced spaghetti sauce, more slowly emerges the pitch to marginalized groups, for example, young gay and lesbian audiences gradually being targeted by mainstream media. Capital uses identity to segment markets and fine-tune product design and marketing campaign. Marlboro's reversal from being a woman's to a man's cigarette being a classic case. As, quote, identity markers, and, quote, become increasingly sophisticated, so do products and ads. As consumption goods are increasingly designed not just to serve a purpose, but to, quote, make a statement, or, quote, show attitude, end quote, capital expands its business of constructing and deconstructing more or less complex identities up for sale. A real estate ad in our local newspaper for a swinging, quote, new, quote, singles complex proclaimed, quote, rent a lifestyle, end quote. Increasingly, identity functions like a computer's, quote, format painter, end quote. Just drag Eddie Bauer or Wrangler across a recreational vehicle, Barbie across a lunchbox or umbrella, Harley Davidson across a tavern, Michael Jordan, well, you name it. We like Mike. Identity spreads and sells. Not only does capital instrumentalize identity, capital turns multiculturalism and identity politics themselves to a profit. Think of Benetton's, quote, United Colors, or its AIDS DeathBed ad. Virginia, quote, you've come a long way, baby, end quote, Slims. Homoerotic ads for clothing or perfume, and so on. And progressive corporations jostle for the public's attention and goodwill by visibly putting themselves at the cutting edge of identity politics in the business world. Providing childcare, sponsoring diversity workshops, providing benefits for same-sex domestic partners, and so forth. Of course, searching for, maintaining, and enhancing one's identity opens up profitable opportunities for capital, ranging from genealogical services to all sorts of identity paraphernalia. G. Often imputed social identities are meshed with capitalist social forms and class divisions. Postone argues that Nazi anti-Semitism was a variety of misplaced and misconceived anti-capitalism in which, quote, the Jew, end quote, was the scapegoat for the most hated capitalist roles, merchant, landlord, banker. Footnote. See Postone's famous article, Anti-Semitism and National Socialism, published in Germans and the Jews Since the Holocaust, edited by Anton Rabenbach and Jack Zipes, 1986. End footnote. Or consider gender identities. The association of the masculine with the moneymaker and the feminine with unpaid domestic work illustrates the problems with a, quote, demarcationist, and, quote, approach to capital and recognition. Male and female roles are defined in part by the going capitalist forms of labor and recognition. Common stereotypes of targeted ethnic and racial groups collect around specifically capitalist forms. Impoverished African Americans are unemployable, that is, make poor wage laborers, and African Americans generally lack the entrepreneurial skills for small business. Conversely, the stereotypes have it that Jews and, quote, Asians are rapacious small merchants. To conclude this section, in capitalist societies, the social forms that belong to the makeup of capital enter in multiple ways into the determination of group identities and into identity politics. The rich Marxian category of capital provides conceptual resources to sort out those ways, while the Ricardian notion of, quote, wealth draws a blank. New section. Conceptual and political blockages and openings to recognizing capital. Heading: Getting beyond the conversation stopper. It's the economy, stupid. I can recognize and fight a cold without knowing about viruses. Similarly, many capital's effects can be known and combated without their being recognized as effects of capital. Nonetheless, it is the task of critical theory to articulate what capital is and to show the practical relevance of such knowledge. In recent elections, public discussions seem to break off after determining that, quote, it's the economy, stupid, end quote. What more is there to say? Footnote: Michael Sandel narrates a history of the watering down of the civic humanist elements of U.S. public discourse regarding political economic matters in the book Democracy's Discontent, America in Search of a Public Philosophy. End footnote. The work of critical theorists involves, on the one hand, identifying and removing conceptual and political blockages to recognizing capital, and on the other, making the most of the opportunities to recognize capital that come our way. We begin by identifying a few overlapping conceptual blockers. There are three common and crude views of capital that impede recognition of what it really is are: A, the quote commerce and industry end quote picture, B, quote wealthism, and C, quote consumer society. All three derive from what we earlier labeled, quote, the illusion of the economic, end quote. A natural way of looking at wealth in a capitalist society is to break it down into a generalized circulation of wealth whose basic forms are money and commodities, buying and selling, accompanying a process of production that, devoid of any determining social form, simply transforms material inputs to create new wealth. This picture, a capitalist economy as a commercial and industrial economy. This pictures a capitalist economy as a commercial and industrial one. The trouble is that the picture excludes capital itself, for capital is not simply commodities, money, or the use values needed for production. It does not belong to the nature of any of those to produce surplus value, profits, rents, interest. Yet bearing surplus value is capital's ruling passion. B. The common celebration of, quote, industry and, quote, wealth is an expression of what may be called, quote, wealth fetishism, or, quote, wealthism, which takes the endless spewing of products of an undisclosed social form to be the purpose of production. Footnote: on this score, it is worth noticing that where Adam Smith called his masterwork The Wealth of Nations, Marx called his Capital. End footnote. By contrast, in Book 1 of the Politics, Aristotle observed that true wealth is limited. Nothing should count as wealth but what contributes to the attainment of some identifiable human good, and any such good inescapably stands in relation to the goods of the polis. To the good of the polis. So let me repeat that. I fucked that up. By contrast, in Book 1 of the Politics, Aristotle observed that true wealth is limited. Nothing should count as wealth but what contributes to the attainment of some identifiable human good, and any such good inescapably stands in relation to the good of the polis. Footnote: see Aristotle's The Politics, edited by Stephen Everson, published with Cambridge University Press in 1988. Though the wealth fetish is a byproduct, end footnote. Though the wealth fetish is a byproduct of the capitalist mode of production, the notion that what drives capitalism is the restless desire to accumulate, quote, wealth, is a falsehood stemming from the incapacitation of common sense and various economic theories to recognize the actual social forms ruling capitalism. For it is the uncanny impulsion to accumulate surplus value, not, quote, wealth, that keeps capital's heart pumping. Quote, wealthism paints a conveniently false picture of the reality of capitalism. It gives capitalism a thin but tolerable tale to tell about itself. To speak with Lyotard and Baudrillard, it provides a, quote, meta-narrative, end quote, of material progress that is only an, quote, alibi. C. Representing capitalism as, quote, consumer society, end quote, has its good and bad points. On the negative side, It tends to white out the class distinction between capitalists and wage laborers for at least two reasons. One, capitalists and wage laborers are both consumers and as such employ roughly the same sorts of formal freedoms of the marketplace. Identifying people simply as consumers erases the class division essential to capitalism. Footnote. Marx points this out in the Grundrisse, a quote, "What precisely distinguishes capital from the master-servant relation is that the worker confronts the capitalist as consumer and possessor of exchange values, and that in the form of the possessor of money, in the form of money, he becomes a simple center of circulation, one of its infinitely many centers in which his specificity as a worker is extinguished," end quote. Two, relatedly, talk of, quote, consumer society, end quote. Police cruisers on campus. Some wild shit. Relatedly, talk of, quote, consumer society implicitly gives the impression that the marketplace is populated only with, quote, consumer goods, but that overlooks the fact that, quote, production goods are constantly being purchased, just not by those in the class of wage laborers. But reproducing the class division between those who control, quote, production goods, end quote, and those who must sell their labor power in order to be employed is an essential feature of capital. How does ordinary language block or open up our recognizing capital? Consider the term, quote, capital itself. Quote, capital is widely used simply to mean a resource of whatever sort. Labor power for sale as wage labor is, quote, human capital, end quote, which is a deceptive half-truth. Once it is purchased by a capitalist, it becomes productive capital, but wages are not profits. So for the wage laborer, here labor power does not function as capital. Writing in America magazine, the Jesuit sociologist John Coleman observes how religion's contributions to, quote, civil society, end quote, can buck up, quote, social capital, end quote. If capital is to be recognized for what it is, either we must find a new term for these obfuscating images. If capital is to be recognized for what it is, either we must find a new term, or these obfuscating usages need to be challenged by critical theorists. Footnote. There's two footnotes here. Marx points out in the Grundrisse, a quote, "What precisely distinguishes capital from the master-servant relation is that the worker confronts the capitalist." Did I ever see this? Sorry, I'm kind of spacing out because there's like police activity around near me, but I'm not really sure what they're doing. They kind of like rode up on the sidewalk to like the front of the library, and now we're just kind of sitting there. I don't think they got out of their cars, but they're acting like it was some real emergency, like honking at their horns at people on the sidewalk, and now they're just kind of sitting there. I don't know. Interesting stuff on America's campuses. Marx points this out in the Grundrisse, a quote, "What precisely distinguishes capital from the master-servant relation is what the worker confronts, bracket, the capitalist, end bracket, as consumer and possessor of exchange values, and that in the form of the possessor of money, in the form of money, he becomes a simple center of circulation, one of its infinitely many centers, in which his specificity as worker is extinguished," end quote. End footnote. Footnote. See John A. Coleman's article, "Under the Cross and the Flag," published in America in 1996. in the journal America. The terms, quote, industry and, quote, product. Did I say end footnote? The terms, quote, industry and, quote, product are interesting examples of the power of capitalist social forms to determine linguistic usages. What allows us to speak of the entertainment, quote, industry and the healthcare, quote, industry and even the insurance and banking, quote, industries. They are all money-making operations. This tells us that, quote, industry is tracking the social form, not the material features of the activities. Similarly, we now find, quote, product at every turn. Loan options at the bank are different, quote, products. And a chaplain friend of ours informs us that at his for-profit hospital, the distribution of Holy Communion is classified as his, quote, product. In the notion of the gross domestic product, we unthinkingly collapse, quote, product into goods and services in the commodity form. Slurred usages like these are not immune from critical reflection, as the women's movement of the 70s demonstrated in the case of the word, quote, work. The question, quote, do you work, was politicized. There's a model for us. Ordinary language does not simply streamline itself to the requirements of capital. Often enough, it offers handholds for critical observations or commentary on capital. The ordinary distinction between, quote, commerce and, quote, commercialization is one. The emergence of the term, quote, consumer to supersede, quote, customer is another. It marks a new level of capital's intrusiveness that can be conceptualized in Marxian theory in terms of the, quote, real subsumption, and, quote, of consumption under capital. Footnote. Here we are widening the employment of the distinction between formal and real subsumption under capital set forth in Marx's manuscript Results of the Immediate Production Process in Capital Volume 1, translated by Ben Fawkes. I have that piece on the channel, but it is not from that. It's not the one that's from the end of the Ben Fawkes translation. So anyway, end footnote. Our favorite example is the growing usage of, quote, MIC as the, quote, prefix of commercialization, end quote. Thus, USA Today is, quote, MIC paper, for-profit schools, quote, MIC education, the television around which the family gathers, quote, MIC hearth, and so on. These non-conforming usages provide openings to a more articulated recognition of capital and capital's powers. They signal popular discontent with capital's effects. And that's the end of the actual piece, and now we're at the appendix, letter from Patrick Murray to Judith Butler, December 16th, 1995. Dear Judith Butler, I attended the plenary session of the Rethinking Marxism conference at which you, Wendy Brown, and Juanima Lubiano spoke. Given the preoccupation with the events of the previous evening, there was too little occasion to discuss the ideas raised in your three presentations. Your talk was especially thought-provoking for me, as my wife, Jeanne Schuler, and I had presented a paper at the recent Radical Philosophy Association conference in Purdue, in which we criticized Nancy Fraser's essay on justice and recognition. So after the plenary, I wrote down some thoughts that contrast the approach to criticizing Fraser that we took with the line of thought that you developed. I understood your criticism of Fraser to challenge her location of homophobia to the extreme recognition pole in her scaling of social struggles across a space ranging from pure struggles for justice to pure struggles for recognition. You argue that Fraser's putting homophobia on the extreme recognition end of the scale misplaces homophobia. Rather, homophobia should be identified as a, quote, bivalent, end quote, struggle, to use Fraser's term, like struggles against racism and sexism. The crux of your argument, as I heard it, was that the normalization of the heterosexual nuclear family spells homophobia, and that this normalization is an institutional feature of the modern capitalist economy. For the wage labor form requires that there be a domestic sphere in which future wage laborers who will be, quote, free to sell their labor power can be reared. Consequently, homophobia is involved with the capitalist economic order and the injustices it perpetuates. Homophobia is, quote, bivalent. In the wider context of your talk, I took it that this was meant to demonstrate to, quote, orthodox Marxists, end quote, that struggles against homophobia cannot be reductively dismissed as, quote, cultural, quote, superstructural, end quote. If Fraser's, quote, larger aim was, quote, to connect two political problematics, quote, distribution and, quote, recognition, that are currently dissociated from one another, end quote, your paper was meant to show how she failed to do this in the case of homophobia and then to do it for her. I find this to be a compelling objection to Fraser on her own terms, for the sort and site of institutionalized homophobia that you point out is real, and it fits Fraser's description of, quote, bivalence. Our criticism was of a different sort, and has different consequences. Our primary criticism was to challenge Fraser's whole setup, which we think falsely dichotomizes, quote, justice and, quote, recognition in a way that duplicates mistaken readings of Hegel and Marx, made all too commonplace by Habermas and other, quote, demarcationists, end quote. We claim that the horizons of Fraser's conceptualization of, quote, justice are, as has been so often the case in the history of, quote, Marxism, quote, left Ricardian, end quote, rather than Marxian. That is, Fraser attends to the injustice of the expropriation by the capitalist class of surplus, quote, wealth produced by the working class. This is fundamentally a classical or Ricardian framework because it neglects to ask what is the determining social form that, quote, wealth takes in capitalism, a question to which Marx provides a very lengthy answer in the book whose title gives the short answer, Capital. Because the wage labor form and the abstract contractual forms of interpersonal recognition that Marx identifies as constitutive of the sphere of simple commodity circulation, which is a constant presupposition and result of the circulation of capital, belong to this peculiar form of wealth. Fraser's dichotomizing of, quote, justice and, quote, recognition fails, as do classical and neoclassical economics generally, to come to grips with the full actuality of the capitalist mode of production. Whether your own view is liable to this sort of criticism is not immediately evident from the particular criticism you made of Fraser. We further criticize Fraser for not distinguishing between the institutionalization of racism or sexism in our capitalist economy, which is all too real, and what is a necessary feature of a capitalist economy. Thus, we understand the absence of reference to race or sex in Marx's presentation of the necessary forms of the capitalist mode of production to be neither an oversight nor a mistake. It seems to me that your claims regarding the institutionalization of the heterosexual nuclear family are similar to Fraser's observations about institutionalized sexism and racism. I do not see where institutionalized homophobia is necessary for capitalism. That there be a domestic sphere of some sort, so that the supply of wage laborers can be constantly renewed in such a form that they are, quote, free to sell their labor power, is necessary for capitalism. Workers cannot be produced as commodities if they are to be, quote, free. But I do not see the necessity for organizing that domestic sphere around the heterosexual nuclear family. Moreover, if it is necessary, those capitalist firms that are ahead of government in recognizing various rights for same-sex, quote, domestic partners, end quote, must be stupidly pulling the rug out from under themselves. Likewise, given the grip that assorted capitalist interests have over our federal representatives, the level of opposition to the recent legislation enforcing heterosexuality in marriage would appear more remarkable than the passage of the bill. This refers to the Defense of Marriage Act, DOMA, that President Bill Clinton signed into law on September 21st, 1996. The law banned federal recognition of same-sex marriage. A severe shortcoming of the Ricardian horizon of Fraser's essay is that by failing to ascertain the social forms that determine wealth, production, labor, and needs under capitalism, the power of those social forms cannot be theorized and investigated. We argue that the power of the wage labor form works against patriarchy, racism, and homophobia. Marx saw capitalism as a powerful force acting against patriarchy and against pre-capitalist traditions more generally. Quote, all that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, end quote. Marx. Marx saw the epochal significance of capitalism to lie in capitalism's substitution of all-around domination by abstractions, notably by capital's bizarre telos of unending expropriation of surplus value and its accumulation, for the sort of personal domination characteristic of pre-capitalist economic formations. It is in the very abstractness of the wage labor form, in particular, which presupposes only that the wage laborer be, quote, free, in the double sense of being juridically empowered to dispose over his or her labor power, and in need of doing so due to being, quote, free of other means of support, that their distinctive power lies. Though sexism, racism, and homophobia are institutionalized in our capitalist economy, the fundamental abstract forms of capitalist work over time against them. It seems to me that not only are sexism, racism, and homophobia not necessary for capitalism, the fundamental capitalist forms point toward their eventual undoing. The fact that the liberal self presupposed by the wage labor form is so, quote, unencumbered, end quote, a term that appears in some translations of Marx's account of wage labor, that it is such a bare, quote, person, suggests that Fraser's and your hope for a, quote, culture in which ever new constructions of identity and difference are freely elaborated and then swiftly deconstructed, end quote, is one situated at an extreme of the liberal capitalist imaginary rather than being a radical challenge to its defining forms. I enjoyed your presentation very much and would like to have a copy of it if that is feasible. Thank you and best wishes. Sincerely yours, Patrick Murray. That's the end of the piece. Thank you so much for listening.